Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into the recording of our presentation about configurable joins. We're excited to share some really exciting information with you today. First, we're going to get started with some introductions. My name is Emma Hayek. I am a senior Slate strategist with the Implementation and Consultation Division at Carnegie, powered by Underscore, which essentially means that I get to work with schools on either being new to Slate and implementing their instance, or schools that already have Slate, helping them with a variety of projects they want to work on, or maybe figuring out what they want to work on. So essentially, I just get to play in Slate all day, which is the dream. I've been a Slate user since about 2015. I started off as an admissions counselor. Our school was in the process of implementing Slate, and I got to see all of the cool stuff that you can do with it. Fell in love with it, started working on the back end, and then joined what was Underscore at the time, which is now Underscore and Carnegie together, just over a year ago. In working with the Implementation and Consultation Division, we get to partner with really amazing institutions to help them leverage the power of Slate to help interact with students better, or to help make their jobs easier. And I'm going to kick it over to one of our partner institutions. Ryan is going to be co-presenting with me today.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're glad to be here and sharing some of our tips and tricks with you all today. As Emma mentioned, my name is Ryan Walsh. I'm the Associate Director of Admission and Financial Aid Analytics at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. Finishing out my first year here. This is my second institution that I've worked for that uses Slate. I started as a Slate user in 2015 at my previous institution, joined the office right as they were building and starting their implementation in Slate. So I was able to see that process at another institution, and then joined the UNC Asheville team last August, and was tasked to really kind of look at year three with Slate here and be challenged to think about rebuilding and kind of restructuring their instance based on the work that's being done now in this office to change some of our process in reading and selection, along with other parts of recruitment. So I'm really excited to be at a place now where I get to really tinker and play around. And that's where this partnership with Underscore has been huge, to have some support and some guidance from the team, but also to be able to get and introduced to tips and tricks that they see that we can leverage into our instance as well. So really glad to be representing the partnership here from an institution and with a great partner.
All right, so let's dive right into what we're going to talk about today. We're really going to be focusing on the configurable joins query library. So we're going to start from kind of square one. If you're not sure what the query library is, what it is, where you can find it, how you can use it. We're going to give you a few tips and tricks, pieces for organization, best practices, things that we've found as we've implemented across instances that we want you to have in your mind as you're building out the query library. Then we really want to spend a lot of time talking through use cases. Some of my favorite webinars and presentations focus on examples to really spark that creativity, that curiosity, be able to see how your institution could leverage the query library to improve your processes and make things more efficient. Unfortunately, since this part is recorded, we won't have questions and answers, but we will provide our contact information so that you can certainly follow up with either of us with any questions that you have. So starting off, what is the query library? Essentially, the query library allows you to create your own exports, filters, or joins to use instance-wide. So instead of having to recreate an export or a filter in a query, in a portal, in a deliver mailing, really any place that you would be using a configurable joins export or filter, conditional logic on a form, a rule, you can have these pre-built pieces to be able to use instead of having to rebuild them. Just like any query, you can share them pretty granularly. So with a specific user, with a role, so it's the exact same settings as sharing a query. You can choose to share the whole query library with whoever would need to be able to use it. noting that this only applies to configurable joins queries. So we would need to be within the configurable joins bases to be able to get to any of these query library pieces.
So the other first question that you're probably asking is, why would you use these? And there are a couple of reasons that we think are pretty important to discuss from the start. So first and foremost, efficiency, right? As Emma just alluded to, our time is our most valuable resource when it comes to system building. And all too often we're finding ourselves rolling our eyes as we build out yet another complicated filter we swore we would never do again. And so with the query library, you can save time by building those complicated exports and filters once and having them available to you with just a few clicks time and time again. So some of the common ones that we often have to do and often forget about are simple things like filtering out test records or opt-outs or certain populations. But again, there are going to be so many other use cases as you dig into query libraries where it may touch, as Anna talked about, reports, or it's going to talk about conditional logic or some parts of the system that aren't the obvious just queries and reports, but really could benefit from having a well-defined field or filter that you've already built out. Beyond that, that also touches on accuracy, right? Configurable joins are great, but not everyone feels comfortable in that space, and folks lack the level of nuanced understanding about the system to really understand where and how to grab the right fields for filters and exports. So a query library allows for a degree of accuracy and consistency by reducing the need for staff to try to build these filters and exports on their own. And when building these complicated exports and filters and configurable join queries, that takes the time away that you would have had to build them accurately over and over again. And again, you build it that first time and you don't have to worry about building it again. So it won't have the same risk of human error because you've thought critically about how to build it correctly the first time and don't have to put that level of thought in every single time. And finally, staff development and empowerment. And this is my number one reason for wanting to use the query library. While we may not need to, many of us are fine to rebuild these filters and exports time and time again, knowing that the only thing we've lost is our own time. However, with staff, onboarding, developing, and empowering users in Slate can take time, which is hard to make time for, and we don't necessarily have the ability to document every nuance. And therefore, again, building out a query library provides more opportunity for staff to dig deeper with their queries and reports, but with that added confidence that their data will be accurate and as their queries get more complicated. Additionally, many folks learn in Slate by trial and error and or just working with examples. So having some pre-built configurable join queries, filters and exports to pull from allows staff to see how they are built, and they can work to build more complicated filters in their own queries and reports because they have an example to work from. So again, it's about giving your staff and your team more confidence to understand the system and to create for themselves, which ultimately saves many of our Slate users and captains some time to focus on the big picture stuff that we need to make time for.
Great, thanks, Ryan. One analogy that I like to use when thinking through the query library is getting a bunch of groceries, a bunch of ingredients to make a meal. You certainly could take the time to create a really phenomenal dish if you have the knowledge, the skills, and as Ryan really emphasized, the time to be able to make that. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but sometimes we don't have time to start from complete scratch. So to me, the query library is equivalent to having some pre-prepared pieces. Maybe that's just some pre-chopped produce. Maybe that's an entire dish that you're able to just create and pull in right away. So it's going to decrease the knowledge that you have to be able to implement these pieces, as well as speeding up that process, even if you do know what you're doing. So this is going to show us, at least currently, how to access the query library. If any updates in the test environment have given us a sign, I think this is going to look different post-summit. But as of right now, this is how you would get to the query library within production. So under queries preview, I have a sneaking suspicion it's just going to appear as query library in the future. But this is where you would be able to go to actually build out your exports and filters to be able to use, which we'll show you how to do in just a second. This is what it looks like within the query library build out. So it looks like a normal configurable joins query. You're going to choose what base you're building off of. You're going to add some exports. You're going to add some filters. The difference between how this is set up versus a traditional configurable joins query is you're essentially building export blocks and export filters. So you want these to be packaged together when you're building out a new configurable joins query. So this is kind of how you're organizing your exports and filters. You're very likely going to have some filters that are contradictory. So you might have a filter that says, has visited campus but hasn't yet applied. And you might also have a filter that says admitted but not yet deposited. That's always going to return 0 results because you have mutually exclusive pieces of information in your filters. So you're not necessarily going to use all of those filters, but we're pre-building filters that we can pull in selectively into a new query that we would be building out. This is going to show you how we're going to use our query library exports and filters. So we're starting fresh. We're going to go into a brand new quick query, configurable joins person base. We have no exports or filters currently in here. But when we click export, we can see the query library build out as a header. Here are all of our pre-built exports that we just showed you in that previous slide in the query library. So we have some fairly complex exports in here. We are looking at the event list. So we're looking at person scoped and app scoped events, their registration statuses, the title of the event, the date they attended. That all comes in immediately when we add that export. Same with our filter of having been admitted for at least 7 days. You can see that there's some formatting to make these exports look nice. We have line breaks. We're concatenating some literals so that the registration status is in parentheses after. And it was literally just a click of a button to be able to pull in those exports and filters. So you can see how this can expedite building out what would be a lot more of a complex build, both in terms of time and knowledge. It's really just kind of drag and drop within that quick query. Now we're going to dive into some tips and tricks to keep in mind as you're starting to build out within the query library. If you hear any of my tips and tricks, this is the one to hear. There's a reason why it is #1 in our tips and tricks. There is not a live link between the query library and where it is being used in your instance. And I promise you that's how you want it to function. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But first, let's explain what does that mean. So let's look at some things that are live links: a content block, a translation code. Probably one of the biggest perks of those, right? You update it in one place. The content block is updated all of the places that you're using it. That translation code is updated all of the places that you're using it. There's no refresh. There is no anything necessary for that to be updated. It's a very seamless process. It's a live link. Things that are not live links: deliver templates. If I create a deliver template and then I create a mailing with it and I update the deliver template, that mailing is not going to be updated. It is not a live link. Same idea as copy and paste in Slate or out of Slate, right? If I copy something and paste it, and then I update what I had previously copied, the pasted item is not going to be updated. And that's how you should think about the query library. So if you create a query library export, you filter something in a portal, and then you update the query library, the thing in the portal is not going to be changed to match that query library. Same that if you update that export, it's not going to retroactively update what's in the query library. So there is no live link. Think of it as a copy and paste. Why do we want it to work this way? Well, that means that we can create exports and filters that are kind of our template for pieces. So maybe we want to have a query library filter that says someone has been admitted for at least 7 days. But in Ryan's instance, he actually wants to filter on students who have been admitted as of this minute. So we want to look at now instead of that 7-day delay. We don't want to have to create an iteration of that filter for every single time that we potentially might want to filter on. And we certainly don't want someone to inadvertently update a filter in their query, and now someone's seeing something in the portal that they shouldn't be seeing, or a deliver message is going out because those links were live. So we want it to work that way, but it is also very important to understand that it works that way. So if you do need to make a necessary update, say we add a new decision code and we update the query library, we're going to need to know the places that that filter is used in other places and make sure that we update that as well. Now, this is showing us how this works. So this is showing us admitted for at least 7 days is what we pulled in from the query library. I'm adjusting it and I'm saying I actually want to look at 3 days instead of 7 days. Great, I can do that in my query. If I go back to my query library, it's still going to show admitted for at least 7 days, both in the title and in the subject. Highly recommend updating the title and updating the filters or the exports, whatever it is that you're using. Be able to trust what that title is. We'll get into that a little bit more. When in doubt, build in the query library. You currently cannot move a standard query into the query library. So if you build out a really complicated filter in a non-query library query, and now you decide you actually want to be able to use that in multiple places, you would have to rebuild it in the query library. So when in doubt, start by building something in the query library. You obviously don't have to keep it there if you decide you don't want it in the query library, but it might save yourself some work in the long run. Sharing is caring. Kind of. We don't want to overshare because your query library filters and exports basically act as your pinned filters and exports in the local base. So if you share every single query library block of exports or filters that you've created with everyone who uses Slate, you're essentially pushing down any of those direct filters or exports that are in their query. So while it is great to be able to share these, and I think you're going to want to share a lot of these, maybe don't share the processing team's exports with the admissions staff. If we know they're not going to need to be able to use those, maybe we don't need to share that with them. One of the perks of the query library is that you're essentially being able to kind of shrink the options of exports and filters. Sometimes when new users are coming in, one of the hardest parts is just, I don't even know what it's called. I don't know where to look for it. There's so much in here. So to be able to give them a little bit more narrow of a window helps them focus in on the things they should be looking at. One thing to note is you do have to share it to be able to see it. So if you are building out a query library and you're seeing, why isn't someone being able to see this in their query, check the sharing permissions and see if you've actually shared them with the user or the role, however you want to share those. Be descriptive. So I hit on this just a little bit in the beginning, but to me, one of the advantages of being able to name your exports and filters is, one example is our North Carolina non-rural counties and rural counties. If we were using this in a local base, we would probably have a filter that is, their mailing address or permanent address or however we're filtering on this, and then the counties are selected. So you'd have to click in to be able to distinguish between what group of counties we're filtering on. If we can label it ourselves, let's label it as clearly as possible. So we can say attended any event, virtual or in person. We get to distinguish between that. Maybe we have one that has been on campus, right? And that would be that they've attended a template or a folder that we've designated is always an in-person visit. Maybe we want to look at students who have registered for any future event, whether it's virtual or in person. And you can see how we can make variations of these pretty easily within the query library. And we're speaking in not too technical of terms, right? If a counselor comes into your office and says, I'm looking for a list of, what would they say? And that's what your filter should be describing. Now we can obviously layer filters together. So we could say, I'm looking for North Carolina rural county student that is registered for any future event, right? We don't need to combine them all together, but we want to be very, very descriptive so that we can trust what our filters are saying. Our last tip is to be strategic with the naming, not only of the filters, but of the query library header itself. So that's what's going to show as your header row within your exports and your filters. So this is how you're kind of organizing them together. So in our example, we just have query library build out. We wouldn't do that in practice, right? We probably want to have maybe communications exports and filters. Maybe we want to have commonly used. Maybe we're looking at event statuses. We have some pre-built exports for super scores so that we're not having to do those calculations within configurable joins each time. You'll notice that what it is named corresponds to the header rows. you might be wondering why they aren't all showing up here. So one of the things to keep in mind is the query that we are taking this screenshot from of library exports is a person-based query. So we are not actually seeing our application exports. It looks like that arrow is off just a little bit. We're not seeing our application exports here because we're not joined to applications. So you don't actually have to be within the same base. You just have to be joined to that base. So if I have commonly used application exports, I can be within a CJ person base. I just have to join to applications in some form, whether it's by rank or all applications. Some of these also are just filters. So our final one down there is territories. We don't have that as an export. We're only using that as a filter. So we are looking for our exports in this screenshot here. So we do not have any exports showing up here. It is also now searchable to be able to search by that header. That did not used to be the case. So we had named our exports territory management : to be able to easily search for all of them. Now that's kind of moot. So be strategic with what you're naming those. What sorts of keywords would someone be looking for with that header? Help them be able to find the exports and the filters that they're looking for. I'm going to kick it back to Ryan to talk through some use cases.
And Emma already kind of alluded to a few of them, right? Some of the things that we know that we're looking for regularly, especially around events, visitation, engagement. Those are some of the most complicated ones that it's probably going to be your first reaction to go looking at some of those. But don't forget about some of the basics, right? So for example, one of the use cases that we find really important in my work is around decisions. This is a current list of decision codes at UNCA, and they were brought in from our previous system and structure, and they are not all being used, right? And so as I'm working to transition our system, it's a matter of trying to work within the system that already existed and trying to figure out what we keep and what we kind of run or retire or sunset. That creates a lot of confusion for counselors, trying to figure out which ones are we actively using, which ones do they need to avoid, and more importantly, we all know that things get complicated around decisions when we start talking about which are released, which ones are confirmed, what does the code need, are they ranked? And so this is a perfect example of where you might want to actually use some filters. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that to get around this challenge, you make pre-built filters to commonly group decision codes by filters. So for example, grouping decision codes by admits only, or admits and commits, or admits who were withdrawn or declined. All of these give us the ability to quickly identify groups that doesn't have staff trying to consider, is this an application or a decision that has been released or confirmed, for example. Descriptive naming, again, is key here. So staff know exactly what group they're filtering on, but they don't have to worry about the nuances of how the decisions were necessarily made or released. Next example here is thinking about how we define groups. So don't filter on the same list of geographic parameters over and over again. Just create a query library filter to pull in your institutional specific definitions. By building filters by geographic or even demographic definitions, it can quickly help staff define certain populations consistently. Common uses might include things like defining international students separate from domestic citizens who are living abroad, first-generation students, or even just geographic territories which may not directly align with staff assignments. For example, as I had mentioned previously, at UNCA, we have a scholarship fund directed towards North Carolinians from rural counties. So building a filter saves staff from having to look up what all those counties are. Additionally, as I mentioned, these are not live links. So if you need to adjust this to look at only permanent address, for example, you can just add another filter of type to your subquery filter. And you can add additional filters to your query library filters when actually using them in the moment. So again, these are not necessarily going to be things that you're going to use just once, or as they're pre-built. You can continue to add the nuance that you need, but you already are having a start of a grouping or a definition. Another way that we'll look to define is considering use case around using filters to define organizations or relationships. For example, as a Gear Up school, we work with a number of specific schools in Western North Carolina. And so building a filter to pull the seed codes for those partnered Gear Up high schools has implications both for our Gear Up team, but also for our Western North Carolina admission counselor as they engage in recruitment and supporting counselor relationships with those schools. There's also the implication around events and how we're looking to find students from these organizations who are engaging with us on campus so we can make sure that we're valuing that partnership as best we can. Another one that may be more institutionally specific, and this is where I challenge you all to think about the nuance of what your day-to-day work is. Sometimes using the query library to group records by a common value or data point can be helpful for auditing your data as well. By leveraging filters in the query library to help identify records with data issues or discrepancies, staff can better manage records and process these quickly. For example, as a system school, in-state residency is actually validated by the University of North Carolina System Office. And so we often find discrepancies where a student may claim residency, but their validated residency status may not actually show that. So by building a filter, we're able to establish a communication plan which automatically contacts students who may have a residency mismatch and provides instructions for revalidating and resubmitting their residency information. So again, sometimes these queries can help automate processes that create efficiency and also accuracy of your data by pushing this directly to students as they need. So again, a couple of examples of where you might think about how your institution is looking at data and thinking about ways that this could actually help you audit and create accuracy within different data points in your system.
One area that we have seen the query library come in helpful with graduate schools in particular is managing what can be incredibly complex program deadlines. So this example here is looking at the program that the student is applying for, the term that the student is applying for, and whether or not that date has passed in each of these subquery filters. So if we click into this, we can see the steps to create this. So essentially what we're doing is we're pulling in those three pieces of information to say whether or not that deadline has passed. You can imagine that if you have a number of graduate programs, this becomes complex quite quickly, especially once we're doing an additional variation for any term that is currently open. We do not want to have to rebuild this in many places at all. So using a query library filter allows us to very easily use this in a lot of different places. So we could use this to show a message in the portal. We could use this to trigger a communication or potentially just maybe say a different paragraph of text in a communication. We also really started to build this out for our application logic. So traditionally, because there is not currently the not in function of a page key, we were creating a page key for folks who had a deadline that passed, a page key for folks that had a deadline that hadn't passed, so that we could hide all subsequent pages, but also show kind of an error page, right? That says, hey, the deadline has passed for the program and term that you've selected. Here's what your options are, to really create a very seamless user experience. Now we can create this filter once in the query library and just drag and drop it into any of those places that we need to create it. So we could create a hard fail. We can create, like I said, filters in a portal. They're all going to be updated. But one thing that I find very helpful is leave yourself breadcrumbs within pieces that you know are going to be updated as a part of cycle prep. So in this example, we have the date that it was last updated. Maybe you want to use, valid through fall 24. Maybe you're marking that more on the entry terms that those filters cover, so that when you have to go through and update this, you'd update it in the query library, potentially by just updating the filter, potentially by saving as copy, depending on whether or not you potentially need to use different versions in different places. But then we would update the name in the query library. When we're using it, it's a 60-second update. We go in, we delete the old filter, we add the new one in. Then you know all of the places that you've updated that filter. So this could apply to deadlines. This could apply to a lot of other places. If you know that you're going to need to be updating this year over year, include that in the title, especially if we're going to have to be updating it in a lot of places, and someone walks into your office, you get distracted, you don't remember all the places that we've updated. Very common thing that we filter on is if they are non-applicants, we want to look at their person scoped information. But if they've applied, we want to look at their app scoped information. So instead of having to create those joins, those or statements, once again, this really comes back to efficiency for Slate captains, but also the knowledge necessary to be able to create this accurately as a new counselor is really challenging. Let's pre-create these filters for counselors, for communications, for audit queries. Let's make this as easy as possible. We found that a lot of people are very comfortable coming in and adjusting the filters once they're in there. So if I'm a counselor and I need to change this to be spring 23 instead of fall 22, most people are pretty comfortable coming in here and doing that, but they don't know how we got here to start off with. So once again, starting them with that template, giving them the tools to be able to become more comfortable with this. And then it's less of a learning curve when they want to actually be able to build these filters and exports out themselves. They've seen the back end a little bit, but they didn't have to start from scratch with this. Because we like to provide lots of food for thought, we have a few additional ideas for some sets of query libraries. So kind of some overall, what would your heading be? What would the blocks of exports and filters be? We've touched on a few of these. Commonly used exports and filters for communications. To be able to hit select all and have all of the exports that you need for your query saves you some time. Be able to filter out, as Ryan said, we're filtering out test records, we're filtering out opt-outs. We want to have it pre-built to remove international students from our financial aid push. Not only is it pre-built, but I think it's also planting the seed of these are the things I need to remember to filter out, or the exports that I need to remember to include in this mailing. For counselors, what pieces are counselors commonly looking for? Advisors using Slate for student success. Let's pre-build those filters and exports so that they can easily get to the information that they need. Our portals team here always builds out the query library filters first, gets sign off that these are what we're defining as an admitted student, right? Are we confirming? Are we releasing? How are we handling this process? Who should see what at what point? Now everything in that portal is going to match. Same concept can apply if you're managing your portal internally. Now some individual exports and filters. We've touched on international versus domestic. It's a very common thing to be able to export or add as a filter. How that is defined institutionally changes quite a bit. And it might change in the use case, right? Ryan mentioned US citizens living abroad. Those might need to be bucketed a little bit differently depending on how we're communicating with those students. It could also very much change whether we're talking at the inquiry level or at the application level, right? We're going to have a bigger picture of their information. We might not be collecting citizenship at all at the inquiry level, so we can't just rely on that necessarily. Maybe we want an export to show the 3 most recent interactions. Maybe that's helpful context for a student caller to add in their calling query. A current status field is something that we've seen more and more schools have an interest in. So person status, applicant doesn't tell you the full picture, right? An applicant could be denied, an applicant could be enrolled. We want to know more than just that piece. App status, once again, decided doesn't tell me that decision code. So essentially kind of cascading through, if I'm a prospect or an inquiry, great, show me that. But if I'm an enrolled student, that's what I want to see, not just that I'm an applicant. So using that logic to create that as an export or potentially as a filter is going to give you a lot more transparency as to where a student's at in the process. Scholarship statuses, regardless of how you're storing scholarship information in Slate. That could be a concatenated list of the scholarships that they've been awarded. That could be a list of scholarships and their status for it. Maybe they're eligible, maybe they've applied, maybe they've been awarded, and we can see that all in one pre-built export that a counselor is pulling in. Maybe we're using entities, maybe we're using app scoped fields, but either way, that's going to be a pre-built piece so that it's very easy to get to that information. Maybe we want to pull in the rank 1 contact of a school that a student is attending. Any of that information that we might want to be able to pull in, build it in the query library, make it accessible to the folks who might need to use that information, and make it as easy as possible for them. Hopefully we've given you a lot of food for thought. I'm really hoping that you are excited to go to the query library and start building things out, even if it's simple filters like not a test record, not opted out, to be able to have those pre-built and see the way that that can shape the work that you're doing. We'd love to hear from you, any questions you have, any ideas of ways that you are using query library filters and exports that you found to be valuable. Please feel free to reach out to us. We love talking about this. So we would be more than happy to continue the conversation with you and brainstorm and see all of the new ways that this can help improve the student experience, as well as hopefully your own experience and your staff experience as well.
Thank you, folks. Looking forward to hearing from you soon.
Thanks, everybody.